So, welcome all to this webinar. This is the second run of our webinar about the fair data principles, and it is organized by LIBER, the Association of European Research Libraries, and more concretely by the Committee Scholarly Communication and Research Infrastructures. And we will have today a speaker, which I will introduce shortly. Just a few remarks. You will have noted that there's a chat on the right-hand side. Please use the chat for your questions. We will come back to these questions after the presentation. And the webinar is also recorded. And my colleague from LIBER will make these recordings available shortly after the webinar in the coming days. So welcome to our speaker. Alistair Dunning is with us. He's head of the Research Data Services at the 3TO Data Center in the Netherlands. And Alistair will provide us with his insights on the fair data principles. He and his colleagues looked into data repositories and checked if they comply basically with the principles. And yeah, he will walk us through his findings. And yeah, let's now hand over to Alistair. So Alistair, I hope you are ready to take it away.
Thank you, Birgit. I'm just looking to see if everyone can hear my voice okay. I'm presuming that you can. Good, thank you. So, are the fair data principles fair? This is some work that my colleagues Yasmin, Madeline and myself did. We're based at the University of Delft, and we also are hosts of the 4TU Centre for Research Data, which is the archive for the technical sciences within the Netherlands. Now, this particular piece of work that we've looked into was motivated by various different reasons. The main reason for this is that the FAIR guidelines have become now a key part of the EU guidance related to research data for the Horizon 2020, talking about researchers being compliant with the FAIR guidelines when they're doing the Horizon 2020 bids. But more generally, the FAIR principles are interesting because they provide insights for repositories on how to think about their information architecture and help their researchers make their data more readily available. We also had a very personal viewpoint that we wanted to make sure that our archive was working in line with the FAIR principles as best as possible. And also we want to improve our own interoperability and our reuse of our data sets in our own repository that we have here in Delft. So what we've done with this actual project is we've looked at 37 repositories that are all affiliated with the Netherlands, and we've compared them all to the FAIR principles. Now there are 4 FAIR principles for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and then they have 3 or 4 facets each. So I will talk in this presentation about the 4 FAIR principles, and then there are the 15 facets, which are the kind of individual parts of those principles which give particular types of guidance on how data should be made available. In this research, we looked at these 37 repositories and we applied a traffic light system for each of the facets. So if a repository was found to be complying with the facet, we gave it green, yellow if it was just about, and if it was failing to comply, then we give it red. The 37 repositories that we came up with were taken from Re3 Data, the Registry of Research Data Repositories, and it's all the ones that were affiliated with the Netherlands. They're not necessarily all based here, but according to the metadata in RE3 Data, they had some kind of affiliation with it. Anyway, our interpretation of the FAIR principles, you can see, follow this particular link that I have on the slide here. This goes through each of the facets and says how we have interpreted this when we've been doing our research. The FAIR principles are quite broad, quite vague, as you will see from some of the findings that we have, so different people can interpret them in different ways. So the slide here and the link here shows how we've done it. Other people may interpret them differently. So what I'm going to go through now for the rest of the presentation is 6 particular findings that we have come up with when we're looking at the FAIR principles on these repositories. Some of them are about how the repositories are working, but some of them are also about the FAIR principles and whether they actually are fair and whether they need changes. But the first slide, as you can see here, is that compliance is not high. We were quite surprised that a number of repositories we looked at failed to meet the fair data principles. And moving on to the next slide, you can see some statistics that we have from looking at the 37 repositories. So in terms of the findable principle, only 41% of the repositories we looked at were past the 4 facets of the findable principle. Accessible was a bit higher with 76, but then when we looked at interoperable and reusable, around half of the repositories were not compliant with what the FAIR principles asked. So we found this quite surprising at the outset, because we thought we would have quite high compliance rates, but in actual fact, lots of research data repositories are failing to do some basic things, as we'll look into here. So here's one of the particular examples, one of the most obvious ones we looked at. So F1, metadata are assigned a globally unique and eternally persistent identifier. We found that just under half of the repositories that we looked at did not assign a DOI, a handle, or other form of permanent identifier. Again, we found this quite surprising. We thought for research data repositories that nearly all of them would give a persistent URL, or not a persistent URL, but a persistent DOI. But in actual fact, it was only 38% of them that were complying with this. Moving on to the next slide, accessibility A4, accessibility 4, and that declares that metadata are accessible even when the data are no longer available. This was actually very difficult for us to determine, because this meant that each repository had to have a policy that stated exactly what they did when data was deleted and whether the metadata was still available. And nearly all repositories that we looked at, in fact there was only one that did do this, had a policy that said this is what we do when the data is deleted. Do we make the metadata continuously available? Most repositories didn't even bother doing this at all. So this is why we found it was not clear, because most repositories don't write about this and don't make the policies available. What else do we do? Well, another difficult one that we looked at was interoperability 2. And that facet declares that metadata uses vocabularies that follow the FAIR principles. This was actually a very difficult one to judge, but we decided that all of the repositories, it would be very difficult for any one of them to say that they use vocabularies that fully followed the FAIR principles. In a certain way, what do I mean by that? Well, do I mean did they use vocabularies themselves were semantic, that were linked, that used all the other FAIR principles about identities? Most of them used very flat ones that didn't follow the FAIR principles. So we found this quite a difficult FAIR principle to follow, or FAIR facet to follow, because it's so demanding, and in a certain way it's also recursive, because it asks that the vocabularies are used also follow FAIR principles. And finally, the fourth graph I will show you here comes from the reusable section of the FAIR principles. R1 declares that metadata have a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. We reckon that 38% of them were not compliant in this. Were not compliant with this one about reusability. But again, it was very difficult to judge what exactly was a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. Did this simply mean having lots of rich metadata to understand the dataset? It's one of the FAIR principles that is a little bit vague and becomes difficult to look into when you're looking in more depth. So that last slide leads me to my second point that I want to make about the FAIR principles, in that some of them are very easily measured, where other ones of the FAIR principles are much more subjective. Let me give you some more examples. Oops. So one of the early ones on findability, metadata assigned a globally unique and eternally persistent identifier. This was very easy to judge. Was there a DOI or similar associated with the dataset? If so, we could easily give it a positive value in our research. But then other FAIR facets are much more vague. So for example, data are described with rich metadata is another one of the principles. What makes metadata rich? Is that having 5 metadata attributes, 10, 15? this is left deliberately vague, and so it's quite difficult to interpret in an objective way. Also, there are other parts of the FAIR principles that are very subjective. So another one is related to metadata meeting domain relevant community standards. But again, judging this in an objective way is quite tricky. Who's to say, particularly in the subject fields where you may have competing metadata standards, which one is domain relevant, or is one more domain relevant than the other? You can do this work and you can find it out, but it's difficult to say with absolute certainty that your repository does this or doesn't do this. And finally, some of them are a bit philosophically dubious or very difficult to understand. If you have to judge not just a repository as using the FAIR principles, but then for vocabularies related to that repository, then it gets very difficult to even do the research to find out whether the vocabularies as well as the repository itself follows the FAIR principles. So this becomes circular because you look at the repository, then you look at the vocabularies. What about the vocabularies related to those vocabularies? This can take ages to understand. So this is part of the FAIR principles that we found very difficult to interpret in a clear way. What else did we discover? Well, we discovered that some of the FAIR principles are very narrow and others are very broad. So what do I mean by the narrow ones? Well, nearly all the facets of the accessible principle are very, very focused. So for A1, metadata are retrievable by a standardized communications protocol. A2, the protocol is open, free, universally implementable. And A3, the protocol allows for authentication and authorization. These are very, very narrow, easy things to define, and they all relate to the same thing. What protocol, for example HTTP, does the repository use? But you might get much more broader ones that take a lot more time to decide upon. So metadata include qualified references to other metadata, and metadata meet domain relevant community standards. These take a long time to figure out, and a long time for a repository to put into practice. And it's one of the noticeable things of the FAIR principles that some are very narrow, very easy to understand, and other ones are much more complex. Additionally, some of the FAIR principles are very technical, whereas others are much more about policy decisions. So on the slide I have here, which are all from the accessible principle, the first 3 bullet points are all about technical things. What protocol do you have in place? If you're using a good protocol, then you pass the FAIR principle. But the last bullet point, metadata are accessible even when the data are no longer available, doesn't depend on what technical infrastructure a repository might have in place, but it depends a lot more on the policies that they put in place. How do they deal with data when it's deleted? So there's a strange imbalance within this principle between some points that are very technical and others that are more policy driven. Now, what else did we discover? Well, as well as looking at broadly at 37 repositories in different subject areas, we noticed that some particular subject areas fared very badly when compared against the FAIR principles. So for example, 7 of the repositories in our survey were drawn from the social sciences. And if you look at their statistics in the context of the FAIR findable principles, F1, F2, F3, F4, we found an even larger number of repositories that were non-compliant. If you'll remember from my graph at the start, it was around 45 to 50% of repositories in general met the F1, the F principle. However, if you look at ones within the social sciences, only about 21% of them are actually compliant with the FAIR principles. So we looked into this a bit more, and we looked into the practice for social science repositories to find out why this was. And very often we found these considerations for data in the social sciences. Data was only available on request, there wasn't a clear license, there may have been plenty of free text documentation on the data, but very little structured or machine-readable data. But nevertheless, it's important to note for all these repositories in the social sciences, they seem to work well within the discipline. And I'll give you one example of this here. So one of the repositories we looked at was the LASA, Longitudinal Aging Study of Amsterdam, which was aging research and collecting data on aging in the Netherlands. And this has been going, I think, since the 1990s. It had lots of publications with it, and obviously it had lots of academic impact. However, when compared against the FAIR principles, it showed up the lack of global identifiers and the lack of structured metadata. There was plenty of free text documentation, but many of the other things that needed to satisfy the FAIR principles were missing. And we found the same kind of problems within climate data repositories as well. We had where the license would sometimes be clear, there would sometimes be free text documentation, but again, there would be no global identifiers, there'd be no structured metadata for each of the data sets. And again, we found the same thing. You would have well-established repositories in climate data. They're obviously being used, but they don't meet the kind of broader, more generic norms of the FAIR data principles. And a good example here, again, the Southeast Asian Climate Assessment, which took meteorological readings from Southeast Asia. Again, no structured metadata, no global identifier, but there would be plenty of documentation which would allow people to reuse the data as they understood it within their particular discipline. So one of the key things that we discovered, and this is the fifth thing discovered, is that for repositories, data repositories, doing some simplish things vastly helps compliance. And these were the 4 points here, which we discovered if a repository was doing, they're likely to be passing the many, although maybe not all, of the FAIR principles. So if a repository is creating a permanent identifier, if it is using an open or a clear license, if that data set has rich metadata associated with it, even if it's something like the 10 or 15 attributes taken from Dublin Core, and that data is available via protocols such as HTTP, i.e. just over the World Wide Web, then you're passing many of the FAIR principles. And I think this is an important point to note for people in research data services and libraries or running data repositories who are giving advice to researchers who are having to do Horizon 2020. If the researcher comes to you and says, how on earth do I meet these FAIR guidelines? A good way to start is by finding a repository that has these 4 attributes here. Most good data repositories will have them in place. But it makes something which can look very confusing, these 15 facets and these 4 principles of the FAIR data, you can look instead at these 4 points here. Do they have them? If they do, you're doing well with the FAIR data principles. So just that's really one thing to look at there, those 4 points. And I'll just finish off with some very final points. I think it's important to remember that the FAIR principles are deliberately vague. The principles to be interpreted and used in different ways. This kind of discussion which this research has brought out is part of what the creators of the FAIR data principles were trying to do. However, they're very much focused on kind of reuse in a research context. There's very little about backup and preservation. And I know my colleagues at DANS, one of the other archives in the Netherlands, are looking about the relationship of the FAIR principles to the data seal of approval, which kind of shows that trusted digital repositories are looking after their data in a curated way. And there needs to be much more work to be done on the relationship between FAIR data and FAIR repository. So you can have a repository which supplies good metadata and good policies, but what about the actual data that sits inside a data set? How is that semantically linked? How does that relate to particular pieces of the FAIR principles? This is pretty confusing, but this is something also that we need to think about more if we're going to use the FAIR principles as a way of judging not just repositories, but individual data sets within repositories. And finally, just moving to my last slide now. So to create a FAIR dataset demands alliance between repositories and dataset creators. If you're wanting to create a really good dataset that's compliant with FAIR, it needs to be put in a good repository, but also when that dataset is created, it needs to be created with the FAIR principles borne in mind. And the last 2 points are more about how I think the FAIR is going to be looked at in the future. But the last point in the slide there is about the FAIR principles derived not from libraries and archives, and people thinking about long-term preservation, but they're thinking more about kind of reuse within the life sciences. I think that's my instinct about where much of the FAIR principles come from. They still require good knowledge of metadata and archiving practice, but it's interesting that we, coming from perhaps a more of a library community, would describe the FAIR principles in different ways and think about them in different ways. This might explain why they're not instinctively understandable by certain people within the library community. And I think the other final point that is important for us to follow as a library community and think about is how are the FAIR principles governed and how are they updated. It's important for us to take this kind of feedback from this kind of research and make sure it gets fed in to the not just to the FAIR working group itself, but also the EU Commission if they're going to be using the FAIR guidelines as guidance for research data in the future. So these are all my points on the FAIR principles. This is my presentation. Thanks for listening, and I'd be keen to take any questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alistair. This session is now open to questions from the audience. Please type in your questions in the chat. We have already received a few. Well, the first question from Mark Bruineel, very active data librarian from the Netherlands. Did the research involve, it's a question about the methodology, did the research involve interviews as well as studying systems and policy documents? Alistair?
Thank you for the question, Mark. So the first round that we did, we were simply looking at the websites without any contact with the people that were running them. We then followed up with email questions to the owners or the named addresses behind the repositories, and we would have, if it was feasible, discussions with the people behind it and updated our results. In many of the cases, though, we didn't have a reply, or the people were too busy, or the FAIR principles were thought to be a bit too complex, and people didn't have time to look into them.
Okay. Hold on a second. Another more philosophical question is from Jadranka. She said, what is exactly the difference in this context between vague and unclear? How should we value that?
I'm vague about the answer to that. I don't. I think I may just have used those words in an interchangeable way.
All right.
But certainly, when we were doing the research, and we were looking at websites, if we found one where we thought, well, is this compliant or is it not compliant, or is there not enough information, then we would mark it as unclear. Whereas sometimes if we could look at a website and it was clear that it wasn't compliant, we would say no, it wasn't unclear at all. So it's really when we had a lack of evidence, we called a repository unclear.
Okay. And another question is that, do you think, Alistair, that if repositories are lacking FAIR information, is that a hindrance to, for example, data reuse, you think?
Yes. What the FAIR principles are really trying to do, or one of the things that they want to do, is to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and of course reusable. So they're really being set up in mind by a research community that wants to reuse that data. And so if you're not following the FAIR principles, you're damaging the possibility of reuse. It's worth also mentioning that the FAIR principles are very much created, I believe, in the context of not just humans reading and understanding data, but machine-readable data as well. So if you look at the examples I mentioned from the social sciences, there where all the data sets could be called human readable because a human going to the website could easily access them. However, if a computer was trying to access them for harvesting or for reuse in text mining or something, then it doesn't have what it needs, i.e. stable identity, structured metadata, to do that work. And so I think it's important to remember the FAIR guidelines are about human readable and machine readable data.
Okay, thank you. Have you thought about feeding back your findings to the repositories you evaluated?
Yes, we have done. What we've found is that many of the repositories, particularly the subject-based ones, are run by just a few staff in a project-like setting, and they don't have the time or the staff to update their infrastructure to create FAIR principles. So one of the big things that we find, and I note this also came as a question that James Davenport has put forward about how the repositories rate. What we found is that institutional repositories and larger research infrastructures tended to do better than subject-based repositories or project repositories. Largely because there's more staff behind, I believe, the kind of institutional repositories that put DOIs, HTTP, proper licenses in place. Whereas academic projects that decide to build a website and then store some data on it, there's less expertise in how that data is being kind of archived and curated in the long term.
Okay. Thank you again. Another question from the audience is that how fair need secure repositories to be when they archive sensitive data?
There's no mention at all in the FAIR facets about the difference between secure repositories and sensitive data. So they're completely silent on this fact.
Okay.
I think what's interesting is how you make the metadata available. If you do have secure data, how do you make sure that the metadata is available so that it can be found even if it's not readily accessible because of authentication reasons?
Right. Yeah, this question relates to another question from Mark that you talked about make data available over HTTP, and Mark says from should the FAIR principles not be targeted toward HTTPS, so the secure layer, because of
Yes,
secure developments?
that's probably correct. I'm not enough of an expert to say, but that sounds like a good thing to say to me.
Okay, yeah. And then there's a question which I don't understand myself. I read it aloud. Would the LCRDM be a good organizer to discuss, review periodically the FAIR principles?
That's a question for the Dutch people in the audience, which is the LCRDM is the Dutch group discussing research
Yes,
data.
I understand. I now see it.
Yeah, that's where this came from originally. So that
All
group
right.
already
Yeah,
is discussing this.
And I wonder, is there already like an initiative to set up coordinators for the implementation of the FAIR principles in communities or national
No,
things?
there's the a lot of this is coming from a group in Leiden, in the Netherlands, the Dutch Centre for Life Sciences, but it's all a bit Wild West at the moment. That's a little unfair to say Wild West, but it's all a bit. There's no kind of real governance or centralized coordination about it at the moment. It's a good idea which has
And also,
gained a lot of speed
one would
quickly.
think, the community should give some feedback as well. I mean, like from different disciplines,
Yeah, that's true.
different
Yeah.
needs.
Yeah, no, you're right, Berger, and this is kind of maybe what the LIBER group could do, is take some of the ID, some of this presentation, this research, but some of the questions and points, and perhaps put that forward on behalf of libraries. That might be something for your LIBER group to do.
For your part of this exercise.
Yeah, well, sorry, yes,
Yeah.
our, yes.
Let's see if we have any further questions. Yes. Okay, here's a question from Vivek Navale. When you say fair data set has to have alliance to repository, does it mean that the data set will reside in one repository only?
Yes, it should do. I don't think it's good practice to have data sitting in to have more than one DOI associated with it.
Yeah, and is related to that is, in your opinion, the entity, the unity of a data set, is that the data set as a whole which should have a DOI, or should the individual variables, for example, should have also?
I think the way it could go in the future is that the individual parts of a data set should have DOIs at the moment. The way that most repositories work at the moment is they archive a data set, that data set gets minted with a DOI. But I think what some groups are doing in different areas where you have the individual data elements might receive a DOI. and therefore the data becomes much more granular and the possibilities for reuse become a lot wider. But there's also greater complexity in how we share and deal data.
Right. Then again, another question on the philosophical point of view. Do you think it is fair to have funding agencies force their clients to share data?
That's a good question, Roland. I'm sure there are many people in this webinar who have a stake in that. As far as I'm aware, for the European Union Horizon 2020, you can pull out. You don't have to take part in their open research data. So if you believe that your data has data privacy or data protection issues, you can legitimately say this data should not be shared. So I don't think anybody should be forced to share their data, and most intelligent funding agencies realize that.
Okay. There's another question I see. Since backup and preservation are not addressed as part of FAIR, then if digital preservation over time is needed, how ill-fair datasets will be migrated over time?
Welfare datasets.
How will? Yeah, of
Well,
course.
I think that's. I mean, Vivek's putting up in a really good point there because FAIR doesn't cover digital preservation and curation, so they're not enough to look after data. This is when you go back to other standards like the data seal of approval, which make specific statements about what a repository should do to have trusted curated data. So this is why we need to think about the FAIR principles, not just the FAIR principles, but we also need to think about the data seal of approval and how it relates to standards from the archiving information world.
Okay. Well, a question that we asked also in the first session was your view on the relation between the principles and policy implementations. Knowing that the principles are deliberately formulated vague, how do you see the relation to the implementation at the policy level?
Well, for that, Rob, that's a good question. I go back to the 4 bullet points I mentioned late on in the slide, which I'm showing here. If you are in charge of a repository and you do these 4 things here about identifiers, licenses, metadata, and protocol, you are meeting many of the FAIR facets or FAIR principles. There are still ones that are much more complex, particularly to do with domain-specific metadata. But this is what the things in these bullet points here are what repository managers should be doing, and I'm sure many of them are doing these things already.
Okay, thank you. Are these recommendations more or less the same as you would give with respect to the infrastructure?
Yes.
So the relation. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we have any further questions coming in. Birgit, do you have any further questions to Alistair?
Not immediately.
Mark's just put in another question there, Rob, I see.
Yeah.
Vivek is also writing. Oh yeah, Mark put with a question. If a project involves multiple participants that collect sensitive data, is it not possible that they store some raw sensitive data locally, but eventually publish everything anonymized? Is this okay?
Yes, that's okay. I think the FAIR guidelines don't really talk about anonymous data or sensitive data, but you're correct. That's you can store sensitive data locally, and if you want to publish it, then you have to anonymize it. The trick there is how do you make data anonymous? I think OpenAIRE is working on a tool for this, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. That will be interesting to see.
If you look forward, Alistair, what would be your recommendations to your own study if you would redo it or do an additional study in other countries, for example?
I would like. Oh, that's a good question, Rob. I would like to do more on the subject repositories and look at different disciplines. Um, and also, I think the other thing that we could do is this is looked at repositories. You could also look at data sets as well, individual data sets. Do they meet the FAIR principles? Do the values within an Excel spreadsheet, how can you make them semantic? How can you make them follow the FAIR principles? And this is pushing the boundaries of what we can do with research data, but I think that's how research data will go in the future when we have much more intelligent data rather than just raw data.
Right.
Yeah, maybe it would be
Yeah,
helpful if you would like put together some brief guidance on if someone wants to go through such an exercise. And I mean,
Yeah,
it might be worth, I mean, having a kind of a call to some communities to look into your household gadgets and yeah, if it's
yeah,
working
yeah.
out for them. Mm.
Yeah, and subject discipline and disciplinary views will also be the focus of the workshop in Patras for the LIBER
Yeah.
conference. So that aligns pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have concrete plans to extend the study to other countries, for example? Or
No, no, I don't. I did notice today that in DLib magazine, there's been a very big study of over 1,000 research data repositories across the world, not in the context of FAIR, but looking at these same kind of issues about policies and practices of repositories. So I kind of think if you want to take this further, have a look at that issue and that research in the current issue of DLib.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So let's put this in the blog post as well.
Well, in the Netherlands, for example, you have training courses for data librarians. Do you think that your study is also some facets, some elements of the study will land into courses where data librarians are trained, and which would be the
Yeah, I
most
think so.
important elements?
I think so. I think there's also some interesting training workshops also been run on how to make your data sets fair. And so there's workshops run where a researcher brings along their data set and they talk with experts about what needs to be done to make this data set more findable, accessible, reusable, etc., etc. And I think librarians have a role to play in there as well, so that they understand all the issues in making data sets and data as fair as possible and can give high quality advice to their researchers.
Yep. Another I find personally interesting question from Andrew Shirin says from OECD several years ago published a seminal paper, um, a similar paper but less complex principles on research data. So how do you see the FAIR principles compared to the OECD principles? I assume you know the document.
Andrew's very kindly just put the link in so I
Yeah.
can
Right.
load up now and pretend that I know what it is. But no, I haven't come across this at all, so it's
Okay.
difficult
Yeah.
to me to say something. Perhaps if Andrew has any ideas, he could put them in the chat box.
Yeah. Questions coming in.
Yeah, and Dominique is mentioning a repository in Latin America.
Yeah.
Saying
Um,
research in this, yeah.
yeah, that's interesting, Dominic. One of the things that we've also thought about is how can we take the concept of overlaid journals from open access and use that in the world of research data. So if a researcher wants to build a nice shiny project website where their project is made available, how can they put the data in a data repository underneath that, and then the project website links to the data repository or harvest the data from the archive, so that the archive is in charge of curation, but the researchers see the context of the research data site of the research on a website with the kind of language they understand.
That sounds very
Um,
appealing. Not
yeah,
another
yeah,
pop-up website for
yeah, yeah,
little thing which dies after a few years.
yeah.
And then Roland is asking how Zenodo is faring compared to the FAIR principles.
Um, if you look, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Zenodo was one we did look at and is in our spreadsheet. Zenodo did pretty well because, like most data repositories based at institutions, they have rules about DOIs, licenses, protocols, and metadata. So the Zenodo fared pretty well.
Okay, that's a comment. I think the last one from Andrew. Um, I'm through. I think through my questions, which I have noted.
Yeah, that's
Birgit.
good.
Yeah, I think so. We are basically.
Yeah, Andrew just followed up with some comments there about
Yes.
different tools for
Different approaches.
comparing research data. So that's interesting. There's a difference. The CDAST or CoinAtlantic.tool CDAST is the one that he mentions in the States, which I haven't come across before, but would be interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I'll give back to Birgit now, and yeah, also on my behalf, thanks everyone for such a lively discussion, and it's good to see there's such great interest in the webinars.
and we will of course review the questions and yeah, if we missed anything, answer in writing. So
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
yeah. Thank you again, Alistair and Rob, of course, and Friedel for supporting this webinar and to all your contributions in that chat. So thank you for today, and we will have more webinars to come. So will be announced through the LIBER mailing list, of course, and also to other mailing lists in Twitter. So
yeah,
Okay.
let us know if you have any ideas for webinars.
yeah, ideas are always welcome. So get in touch. And thanks for
Good.
joining today.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye bye.
bye bye everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.